everybody, and welcome to Unit 4 of Introduction to Psychology. In this video, I'm going to go over the activities that we do for this week. There's two activities. One is the discussion board, the other one is the Unit 4 assignment. And then I'll go into the content for this week, which primarily involves learning, or behaviorism as we call it in psychology. And of course, at the end, I'll mention that if you have any questions, comments, concerns, how you can reach out to me. As always, though, before I get into that, I did want to make sure everybody's aware that if you do still have any questions from last week's material or even previous weeks, please feel free to reach out to me. Either attend office hours, or if you're unable to attend office hours, send me a message through the Canvas inbox, and I'll be more than happy to try to make arrangements to meet with you outside of those office hours. Just know I'm definitely here to help, so please feel free to reach out if you do need that extra help. All right, so up first, we do have the Unit 4 discussion. Now, one thing I will let you know is that both of the assignments for this week involve you actually using AI. I'm saying that because, first off, I think sometimes students are shocked. You're like, wait a second, I thought professors wanted us not to use AI. Well, my kind of saying I use over and over again, and many of you have probably heard me do this already, is AI is a tool, and it can be a very valuable tool. It's not a replacement for learning, and both of these assignments show that. It highlights the fact that you can use AI as a tool to actually enhance your learning. That being said, please remember, you do still have to reference the AI. The way you do that was mentioned in the announcement in the first week of class. So you can go back and look at that announcement. In fact, it actually specifically shows you how to reference AI. All right, so for the discussion, using your favorite AI program, and it can be anything that you want. It can be Copilot, Gemini, ChatGPT, whatever. I'm sure there's like 10, 15, 100 more that I don't know of. What I want you to do is put in the following prompt. So that prompt that you're going to put into your AI program is, what are some reinforcement strategies that can be used for managing, and you're going to insert whatever your job is that you're looking for, either something that you're going into. So I know I have a lot of people going into nursing, surgical techs, things like that. If you want to use a different field, that's perfectly fine. I'm not going to take off points for that. I'm not going to go and double check and say, well, you're a nursing major, but you put in, a different prompt. Probably get the most bang for your buck, I would say, do something that's relevant for you. So either something you're going to be going into or something that you're working in currently. Now, based on the answers that the AI gives you, which techniques would work for you best? Which techniques would work less well than others? And which techniques might not work for you at all? And then I want you to kind of explain a little bit the favorite technique and kind of put in your own words what you think is beneficial about it. And then this is the part where you're going to do a little bit of research on your own, find some kind of supporting reference, and then use that. So, for example, if you're talking about something like using praise within a field, say a supervisor using praise with their subordinates, and that you like that because you personally enjoy it when a supervisor acknowledges you and gives you praise, find a reference that talks about how praise from supervisors is actually a really great way to encourage productivity. Perfect. All right, boom, that's it. Now, it does say here, this is a good chance to kind of practice that paraphrasing. Remember, in APA, you are not quoting those sources. APA strictly states that under only a few circumstances, or as exceptions, you have to paraphrase. So that doesn't mean you're putting quotes. It means you are putting it in your own words. Very important. So for this, it really should be two references, right? There's going to be a reference for the AI, and then there's going to be a supporting reference, something else that you find somewhere. As always, the initial post is due on Wednesday prior to midnight Central Time, and then the two responses to your fellow students is due the following Sunday prior to midnight. But of course, if you want to do those peer responses early, good for you, right? In fact, I strongly recommend you do that because oftentimes students forget to do those responses, and yeah, it's only about 25% of your grade, so it's not going to kill you. But I will say those points add up very quickly. And they're relatively easy points also, right? It's just giving some kind of substantive feedback to another person. That really shouldn't be too difficult. All right, so that was the first activity, the discussion board. The second activity, as with every week so far, is the Unit 4 assignment. So it's going to be a written assignment. So again, we're using AI. Remember, you do have to reference that in APA. So using your favorite AI program, put in the following prompt. And the prompt is create a corporate training program outline for, and then the part in brackets you see on the screen is what job you're going to be doing. As with the discussion, this can be something you're currently working in. It could be something that's like a future career goal. Um, Really not kind of going to limit you all with that. It can really be anything you want it to be. Now, for this paper, you're actually going to copy and paste and then cite, remember that's important, you still have to cite, what the program gives you. So you're actually going to put whatever response it gives you to that prompt in your paper. Now, remember, this is an APA paper. All of these assignments are APA papers. You still need a title page. I'm going to start taking off points for that. And I can tell you from what I've seen so far, many of you will probably start losing a considerable amount of points, if not all of the points, on that rubric for APA, because students are still struggling with it. Even though I've given feedback, even though I've opened it up for you to reach out to me if you need help, students are still not doing it. So unfortunately, that does mean I have to see that you're showing growth. I'll start taking points off. Of course, if you do need additional help, I'm here, and then the Writing Resource Center with Herzing University is a wonderful resource as well. All right, so for this paper, title page, then we're going to copy and paste the prompt that is given to you. Then you're going to write a 1 to 2 page paper. In that 1 to 2 page paper, you're going to explain 1 or 2 psychological theories that could be applied to this program and how they would potentially impact the outcome. What are 2 things you would change and why? What do you consider to be the best part of what AI generated, and why is it the best? So, this is kind of similar to last week's assignment in that the psychological theories, quote unquote, that I'm talking about here, I'm a little lenient on, right? Now, these could be things like those branches or disciplines within psychology from the first week, so things like behaviorism, humanism, etc. Or it could be specific theories such as ones that we're learning this week, like social learning theory or classical conditioning, operant conditioning. It could also be ones from previous weeks. You do have to use something that's a content from this course, though, because really what we're trying to see here is that you can connect the dots with what you're learning in this class by applying it. So that's really important. You do need to use at least one outside source to justify your response. That is in addition to the AI, right? So you should have at minimum 2 references in your reference section, the AI and whatever additional source that you're finding. All right, so now that we're done with going over those activities, and keep in mind the Unit 4 assignment is due Sunday prior to midnight. So now we're going to transition. We're going to talk about the content for this week, which primarily deals with learning. And in psychology, when we talk about learning, we're really talking about that discipline within psychology that we talked about in the first week of class, which is known as behaviorism. Um, Keep in mind, a lot of times students really find this difficult to remember. And they also find it difficult when I say we're going to talk about learning, what most students kind of immediately associate that with is like studying. So like what you're doing by watching this video is learning, right? And that's kind of what we naturally associate it with. However, in psychology, it's a more expansive topic than that, right? It's really sort of like saying learning or how you learned to behave the way you behave. The vast amount of learning that you do throughout your life isn't something that's actually taught to you in a book or in a classroom. It's taught by trial and error. It's taught by you making a choice to do things that are more beneficial for you or avoid things that are detrimental. It's frankly most of it done just by watching other people and kind of copying them. So kind of keep that in mind, right? Don't just focus that learning must just mean like studying or or kind of like academic achievement. All of us learn. We learn from a very, very young age. In fact, we actually do a little bit of learning when we're in the womb. So the other part of this is that, considering what I just said, learning is a very expansive topic in psychology, far more complex than we could ever hope to go into in a 1 week segment of an 8 week class. So you see here, it says, while there are many methods that help us learn about the world, there are a few common types of behavioral learning in the field of psychology. So the core, really the three core types of learning, are classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and then observational learning. So to unpack something first, that term conditioning, you can kind of think of as just being synonymous with learning. What it technically means is learning that's done by making an association with something. So I'll get into detail with each of these, but classical conditioning is essentially associating something, we call it a neutral stimulus, with an instinct or a reflex. Operant conditioning is associating the benefit of doing something, right? So it's sort of like a cause and effect. So basically, you're probably going to be more likely to do things because you're associating doing that thing with a benefit. Observational learning is different in that it is much more passive and you're not really making any kind of association. To be frankly honest, this is kind of the easiest one. You're just learning by watching other people and kind of copying what you see, more or less. So let me go into detail on each of these. And as I do, just like I do every week, I'll try to tie it into a couple really good examples that hopefully will help you learn the material a little bit better and help it stand out in your mind. All right, so up first we have classical conditioning. And classical conditioning, out of the three I just mentioned, is the oldest. It actually goes back to a man named Ivan Pavlov. You may have heard that name before. He was a medical doctor, and this is the latter years of the 1800s, beginning years of the 1900s. He was a Russian physician, and he was doing research to really explore kind of how the digestive system functions in humans. To do this, he was doing a series of different experiments using a variety of different animals, but most famously dogs. So you may have heard reference to Pavlov's dog. So what he did in this specific experiment was he wanted to look at what role salivation plays in digestion. So basically, your production of spit, right? What role does that play in the digestive process of you eating food, helping that kind of be metabolized in your body? Now, part of this experiment, one of these experiments, was that he had these little contraptions on dogs' jowls to measure how much saliva they produced. And as part of this experiment, they would measure just overall how much saliva they're producing just generally. They would feed the dogs, and they'd kind of measure how the dogs changed that in response to seeing the food, eating, and then afterward. Right? Sounds horribly boring, right? It's not the kind of experiment that I think I'm like, wow, that'd be really cool. The thing is with this, though, and this is kind of the important part, and it's sort of unintentional, is that prior to feeding the dogs, the lab assistants would ring a bell. Kind of think of those old westerns where they, hit the bell like, y'all come and get it, food's up. So why this is important is that in the course of the experiment, what they found was that the dogs, just from hearing the bell, started to change how they reacted biologically. I'll explain. Dogs, like us, believe it or not, salivate over food. I haven't had any lunch yet. I'm recording this. It's late afternoon. I can tell y'all I'm a little hungry. If somebody threw a pizza down in front of me right now, or maybe a big thing of barbecue, I can tell you I will be salivating. My mouth will be watering. Now, that is a reflex. Nobody taught little Professor Fox how to salivate over food. It's part of being a human being. This is a built-in part of our biology. Well, dogs are the same way. Maybe they produce a little bit more than humans do. I definitely have known a few dogs that produce way more than I could ever possibly dream of. but it's still a reflex reaction. Now, what ended up happening in that experiment, remember I said conditioning is associating? Well, what you associate is a neutral stimulus. And what a neutral stimulus means is something you don't naturally have a response to, right? If this was a classroom and I walked into class and I just clapped my hands, you don't associate that with anything, right? Maybe you associate it thinking, wow, what's wrong with Professor Fox? But what if I did that every day and I said, all right, folks, we're going to start class. We're going to start class, and I clap. Probably after 2, 3, 4 weeks, me just clapping as I walk in will probably make you think, okay, put the phone away, pay attention, get my notebook open, because you associate the clapping with something. Well, that's what happened in this experiment. The dog so associated that ringing of the bell because it was paired with the food that days and weeks into that experiment, the dogs would start salivating just over the sound of the bell. The food didn't even have to be present. Now, when you think about it, that means they actually changed a biological reflex just because of an association. They learned that association. Now, there's a couple really interesting, important terms for you to know within classical conditioning. I already talked about one, neutral stimulus. But there's others. We have stimulus and we have response. Now, think of this as cause and effect, right? A stimulus leads to a response, leads to the effect. So initially what we have, and what we had, I'll use the example of Pavlov's dogs, is in this first section here, right? Dogs salivate over food, just like people do. Our mouths water. Because that is a reflex, it's not something that's taught to you, we refer to the food in that case as being an unconditioned stimulus. And salivating over it was an unconditioned response. A good tip here is think of that word like condition in this sense as being learned. So it's an unlearned stimulus that leads to an unlearned response. Unlearned as in you didn't have to learn it because it's just naturally there. Now, what happened in the experiment, this says whistle here, it's really a bell. They paired this bell or the whistle in this diagram, which is a neutral stimulus, right? Neutral means you have no response to it. And over time, they so paired or so associated that neutral stimulus with this unconditioned stimulus that then what ended up happening was even if the food wasn't present, the dog still had the same response to that whistle or that bell. Now, once that happens, you can't say that that whistle or that bell is a neutral stimulus anymore because the definition of a neutral stimulus is you don't have a response to it. Well, you do now. So once that happens, that whistle, that bell becomes a conditioned stimulus or a learned stimulus. And your response to it, a learned response or a conditioned response. Now, classical conditioning can get a lot more complicated beyond that. For example, in this case, once the dog is salivating over the sound of a whistle, you can then pair something else with that whistle, with that conditioned stimulus, and the process can keep going on and on. We call that higher order or second order conditioning. Now, I said I'd give examples. So why is this important? Well, I'll give you a couple, reasons. I'll give you one big reason, but also give you another example. Let me start with that example first. I once had a friend who worked in a 911 call operator, right? So she would answer 911 calls. And that's a pretty high volume, at least that call center was a pretty high volume 911 emergency operations center. And she was doing a lot of overtime because they were always short-staffed. And I remember one time I called her, it was just like a weekend or something like that. I just wanted to hang out or just chat. And when I called, she answered and she goes, hi. And I was like, were you about to say 911? And she goes, yeah. Because when she answered the phone all the time, it was 911 is a police, fire, or medical emergency. Right. So she got so ingrained because she was working so much for that was kind of the natural response. Phone rings, you answer, you say this. Phone rings, you answer, you say this. Phone rings, you answer, you say this. And then a friend calls and you answer it saying 911 is the police, fire, medical emergency, right? In that case, it's kind of this reflexive reaction. It's classical conditioning. Uh, Better example, and I'll give you kind of two here, of why this ties into psychology. So the first one comes from me. When I was about 8 years old, I was walking into the backyard of the house where my family was living, and there was a big kind of like concrete like patio in the back. Go in the backyard. I was young. I wasn't really paying attention, and I kind of noticed something on the ground. I thought it was the garden hose. Being 8 and being in a hurry to go running outside, I didn't really pay too much attention, and I stepped on it, and I immediately regretted that because it wasn't a garden hose. It was a snake, and the snake bit me. In that split second, mind you, I freaked out. I was yelling, I was screaming, I went running in the house, I was dragging my foot behind me, gave myself a horrible rug burn. My mom about had a heart attack, right? She came running in, what happened? A snake bit me, and I'm crying, right? Tears rolling down my face. Now, keep in mind, I'm from Florida. The snake was what we call a black racer. It's like a little garden snake, very harmless. In fact, it really wasn't even that big of a snake, from what my mom says. In my little 8-year-old mind, that thing was a dragon. Right? It was like a boa constrictor out there. It was going to kill me. Now, why is this relevant? Well, because that one little event when I was 8 gave me what we call a phobia. A phobia is an intense fear of something. Usually it's an object, sometimes it can be animals, or sometimes it can be settings, like fear of heights. Now, a phobia isn't just a dislike of something. A phobia means when you're exposed to that thing you have a phobia of, it actually triggers like a panic response. And it's really good at triggering that reaction, not even with the object that you have the phobia for, but anything that reminds you of it. So remember, I thought I was stepping on a snake, or I thought I was stepping on a garden hose, rather, right? It ended up being a snake. Well, guess what I did when I saw a garden hose? I'd freeze up. I'd panic. My heart would be racing. Some people have it so bad that they can't eat like spaghetti or gummy worms because it triggers that same reaction. Now, how's this tie into classical conditioning? Well, prior to that, snakes were honestly a neutral stimulus to me. Thinking back, I kind of think like I remember they existed, but I didn't really care about them. It wasn't like I hated them, I liked them, I was afraid of them. But in that split second, I classically conditioned the fear and the pain I was experiencing, and I associated it with that snake because it was the cause of it. And I developed a phobia, and it lasted for years after that. And it's interesting because that split second, I did what it took Pavlov's dogs weeks, in some cases, to do. Why? Well, it's one thing to associate a sound with food, but it's quite another when it triggers a really strong reaction. That's a lot quicker of a process. Another example is things like food aversions. So this was a friend, and I'm not saying that like this was really me, but I'm going to say it was a friend because it's embarrassing. This was legit a friend. And it wasn't the same friend that worked in the 911 center. But anyway, she went out, had dinner with her husband. She had a chicken breast. And unbeknownst to her, that chicken was contaminated with salmonella. She didn't know it because you can't taste salmonella. But later that night and into the next day, she became violently ill. This is disgusting, everybody, but the way she explained it was that she had explosive both end symptoms. You can imagine what that is, right? Diarrhea, vomiting. Had to go to the hospital and spent 3 days in the hospital. Really bad stuff. Here's the thing though, right? Salmonella really doesn't have a taste, right? You can't detect it, it's not you can smell it. So she associated chicken as being it. And to this day, and this happened years ago, she won't touch chicken. And it's not like she dislikes chicken. Physically, the thought of eating chicken makes her physically ill. She will feel nauseous. She'll kind of do dry heaves. And it's not just chicken either. It's really any poultry. She won't eat duck. She won't eat chicken. She won't eat quail, like nothing. Classical conditioning again, right? She associated that chicken with how sick she felt afterwards. So moving on, we have operant conditioning. Now, remember, conditioning is associating something. With classical conditioning, you're associating a neutral stimulus with an instinct or a reflex. With operant conditioning, what you're doing is you're associating really an action with the benefit or the detriment of it, right? So you see here on the slide, the learning of voluntary behavior through the effects of pleasant and unpleasant consequences to responses. In many ways, you can kind of think of this as causation. So basically, you are more likely to engage in behavior that leads to some kind of benefit, and you're more likely to avoid behaviors that lead to something bad happening to you. Makes sense, right? So remember, with this, we're not associating a behavior into a reflex through pairing, like a sound with a food. We're pairing a behavior with kind of what we view as being, the effect of that behavior. For that reason, this is a little bit more active of a process, right? It doesn't mean you necessarily have to use a lot of thought for it, but it definitely takes some cognitive processing of this is the behavior, this is the effect. Now, we had some kind of difficult terms with classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is a little better, but ... there are some terms you need to know, and they can get a little tricky. All right. So to start, there's 4 types of operant conditioning. They are broken up into positive and negative. Now, this is where the confusion starts, right? Positive simply means that some kind of stimulus, something is being added. Negative means something is being removed or taken away. That is important because oftentimes, especially in psychology, people associate positive and negative as being good and bad. And that is not the case here. And in fact, when you write these down to study, my suggestion is in parentheses after you write positive or negative. For positive, you put the addition symbol, the plus sign, so that it makes you think something's being added. And for negative, do the subtraction symbol to remind you that something's being removed or taken away. Subtract it. All right, so it doesn't stop there for the confusion, folks. Sorry. Right? So we have positive, we have negative. Well, there's 2 types of both, right? We have positive punishment and positive reinforcement. We have the same thing for the negative. We have negative punishment and negative reinforcement. Now, the term punishment means that you are trying to do something to decrease a behavior. With reinforcement, you're doing something to increase a behavior. So I'll go through each of these 4, and I'll give you examples of them as I go through. First one we have here is positive punishment. So the positive means we're adding something. The punishment means we're doing that to try to decrease a behavior. Now, be careful with the term, because sometimes I think what students hear, again, remember, they think positive, it means good. So it's like good punishment, right? So that's like, putting a kid in timeout instead of spanking them or something, right? It's not a euphemism. So I'll give you an example, right? Say I have a young kid and they take a magic marker and they're writing with that marker all across the wall, right? And I see that and I take the marker and I put the kid over my knee and I give him a little bit of a spanking. That would be considered positive punishment. That does not mean it's something you should do. It doesn't mean Professor Fox is saying you should spank your kids. What it is you're adding something, in that case, a spanking, and you're doing that to decrease a behavior, right? Because the kid getting spanked probably isn't going to be like, wow, I enjoy this so much, I'm going to continue to write with a marker on the wall. I mean, that'd be weird. I mean, maybe that does happen sometimes, but doubtful. Now, that term, positive punishment, you think, well, yeah, that is positive. That's good, right? Keep in mind, I'm going to give you a real extreme example, right? Same scenario. Kids writing with a marker on the wall. I see that instead of maybe coolly giving a little bit of a spanking, I lose my you know what, and I take the kid and I just start punching them and I slam their head into the wall and I just go crazy. That's also positive punishment. Doesn't mean you should do it, but you're doing something, you're adding something. In that case, what you're doing is a felony, and you're trying to decrease the behavior. I mean, I doubt seriously that kid, if they survive that, is going to write with a marker on the wall ever again. In fact, they'll probably be traumatized for the rest of their life. I'm giving you that really extreme example because it helps really drive that home, right? That positive does not mean good. I hope, at least. I hope and pray that that drives home for you. Positive does not mean good. All right, so that's positive punishment. What's negative punishment? Right? So positive punishment is adding something to decrease a behavior. Well, what is taking away something to decrease a behavior? Well, maybe we go to another example of, kids writing with a marker on the wall. I don't want them to do that. So instead of doing all those things I just mentioned, which you shouldn't do, right? You shouldn't spank kids. You shouldn't definitely do the other thing. What if I put him in timeout? What if I tell him to go to his room or maybe sit in the corner, look at the wall? Right. In that case, what am I removing? I'm removing freedom, his ability to play or do what he wants. So that would be considered negative. You see how confusing it can get, though, right? Because you think, well, that sounds good, and the other thing sounded bad, but one's called positive, the other's negative. Again, don't get confused by that. All right, so that's the punishment side. What about the reinforcement side? This is kind of the better one. So positive reinforcement is adding something to encourage a behavior or increase a behavior. So the example that I like to give for that is, say that we're in a classroom, right? A traditional classroom, face to face, and say it's kindergarten. Maybe I'm a teacher. Well, I am a teacher. Maybe I'm a kindergarten teacher, right, in this example. And I really want to encourage my kids to, participate in class, to ask questions, to be really engaged in what we're doing. So what I do is, if a kid raises their hand and they ask a question, I make sure to give them a ton of praise. I say, good job. That's such a great question. And I'm so happy that you answered it. That was a really good job, right? Praise, I'm adding something, praise, and I'm doing that to encourage a behavior. Because that kid's probably going to be way more likely to actually ask more questions in the future because I like praise. Most humans like praise. Other kids are probably going to be more likely to ask questions because they want that too. Right, so that's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement sounds kind of weird because really what you're doing here is you're taking something away to encourage a behavior. And that sounds kind of like it doesn't make sense, right? Like you're taking something away to get me to do something. Well, keep in mind, usually what's taken away is something that's really bad. It's something that's unpleasant or that we don't like. So this sounds really weird, everybody, right? So the example would be a teacher blaring a loud noise in a classroom, and she'll turn that loud noise off if a student asks a question. Right? It's weird, right? But as weird and extreme as that sounds, you actually deal with negative reinforcement every day. When you wake up, whenever you end up waking up, if you wake up to an alarm clock, guess what an alarm clock is, everybody? That's a negative reinforcement, right? The sound of the buzzer going off is really annoying, and it goes away, it gets taken away when you engage in the behavior it's trying to get you to do, which is waking up. Another good example, the seatbelt alarm, buzzer, whatever you call it in a car, the one that keeps going like ding, 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 ding until you put your seatbelt on. That's negative reinforcement, right? That buzzer is annoying to us, ding, 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 and it's going to keep going on and on and on until you put your seatbelt on, right? Once you put the seatbelt on, which is the behavior it's trying to encourage, that annoying sound goes away, or at least hopefully it does. These terms can be kind of difficult to really comprehend just because, we have that knee-jerk reaction of thinking positive and negative. What I would encourage you all to do is just kind of use examples of this every day or find examples of it in your everyday life. Because the thing is, we see all four of these every day. That being said, I would say the one that's kind of been shown to be perhaps the most beneficial in really changing behavior is positive reinforcement. All right, the last main category we're going to go into is observational learning. You're probably thinking, why does it say social learning theory then on the slide? So observational learning as a whole as kind of a category is pretty easy, right? It just basically says we learn from watching other people. What social learning theory did was it kind of expanded on that. Famously, the person who really explored this and came up with social learning theory was a psychologist, very well-known psychologist named Albert Bandura. And the way that he came up with the social learning theory and really kind of, demonstrated the power of observational learning as a whole was an experiment he did. Sounds stupid. It's called the Bobo doll experiment. B-O-B-O doll, like a, doll a kid plays with experiment. So what's a Bobo doll? This happened back in the 1950s, 1960s, and a Bobo doll is essentially like a giant inflatable toy. It kind of looked like a bowling pin, right? But there was like a clown drawn on it. And the idea is that it was very kind of like bottom heavy. So what would happen is a kid could go up and like smack it around and it would just kind of go back and forth, but it would always stay upright. So what Albert Bandura wanted to do is he really wanted to see and explore kind of like what observational learning is and how it happens and like the limits of it. So what he did in this experiment was that he took a group of kids and he kind of largely broke them up into two subgroups, right? So one group would watch a person come in, lab assistant, who would be kind of upset, right? But didn't engage in any physical way. The second group observed the same lab assistant kind of getting upset and worked up, but there was a big Bobo doll on the stage. And instead of the person just being upset and like whatever, looking angry, this person looked angry and was upset and then started hitting the Bobo doll. So what he did then was he took all these kids and he kind of put them in rooms one at a time. And in these rooms, they had like tons of toys, right? And they could just do whatever they wanted. They were just told, go play, have fun. And they let them do that for a while, like 10, 15 minutes. And then they took the toys away. But they left a Bobo doll. Now, the point here was they wanted to piss off the kids. And I'm sure many of you are well aware, a great way to piss off a kid is to take all their toys when they've been playing with them. Yeah. What happened, though, is they noticed that the kids who observed the lab assistant being upset but not acting physical towards that Bobo doll really did nothing. Like they were upset, they started crying and kind of threw little temper tantrums, but that was it. The ones who observed the lab assistant striking the Bobo doll, though, struck the Bobo doll. They went over and they started kicking and slapping it and tried to bite it, all sorts of other things. So the connection that Bandura does, he said, what if violence is learned? Because these kids were shown violence, granted it was towards a Bobo doll, but almost all the kids who were shown that violence engaged in it in the same way. And the kids that weren't shown it didn't. So you can kind of see the extension. And indeed, the social learning theory has been brought up as a reason why, things like maybe violent video games may not be great or exposure to violent movies and things. I would say it's not that simplistic, but there have been some really interesting studies that have shown really the effects, the long-ranging effects of violence on kids. Now, here's the thing. The stages of this observational learning are kind of important, right? So this is part of the social learning theory. So there's 4 parts, and you see it mentioned here as attention, memory, imitation, and motivation. Sometimes you see it different. So those who may watch my YouTube video on this, it's attention, retention for memory, reproduction for imitation, and then motivation. It means the same thing. It's just the terms are kind of different sometimes. So I'll go into what it is, right? The first part of social learning theory is that you have to pay attention. You have to notice what it is that's being demonstrated. And usually what we call that when a behavior is being demonstrated is we call that modeling. And the person doing the demonstration, a model. Now, that doesn't mean this is like a supermodel on a stage. And in fact, most modeling takes place when the person isn't even aware they're being watched. Any parent or caregiver of a child knows that, right? They catch you doing something one time that you didn't even think that they saw you at, and then they start imitating it. So, attention. Next one, memory or retention. So it's not just enough that you notice something, right? We notice something every day, constantly throughout the day. It doesn't mean we remember it. So it has to stand out. Now that can either be because it was really kind of something significant, different, maybe scary, right? We remember that because it's just like that effect. Or if it's something that's just demonstrated over and over and over and over and over again. I have a little baby, 6-month-old, and he's kind of beginning to start doing his cooing, making sounds. I'm trying to encourage that because language skills are really important. So every night when I put him to bed, I go, ooh, ah, eh, like vowel sounds because I want to encourage it. Well, the more I do it, the more he hears it, right? The more he remembers it. So imitation, or what we call reproduction, so reproducing what you have been seeing, is the third stage here, right? So this is where you start actually copying what is going on. I'm doing all this at night for my son because I'm hoping at some point he's going to start copying what I'm saying. He's going to start copying those noises. And then finally, the hope is that the person engages in the behavior on their own without being prompted. Using the example, hopefully my son will just start making those noises on his own, not to copy me, not when I'm prompting him to do it, but just naturally on his own. The motivation here means you have the motivation to actually engage in that behavior unprompted. Let me tie this in and give you a better example. Because remember I said with Bandura, really he was trying to connect if violence could be learned. So let me give you a more vivid example here and tie it into psychology and a lot of other fields. If you've ever heard somebody say that violence is a cycle, that there's a cycle of domestic violence, it ties in really with social learning theory. So what it means is that kids who are exposed to violence in the home oftentimes are at higher risk of either committing violence as adults or being the receiving end of that violence. Now, it's not 100%. I've known plenty of people, just to preface what I'm about to say, I've known plenty of people who came from horrific backgrounds that are the sweetest, nicest people you'd ever meet. I've known plenty of people who came from amazing backgrounds that are the worst people you would ever meet, right? This is a good example of correlation not being causation. Very important to know. All right, but I'll give you the example. So if I'm a young child, say I'm a young boy, I'm 5, 6, 7 years old, and in my household, my mom, my dad are really violent, right? They get drunk every night. They yell, they scream, they hit each other. It's something I'm probably going to notice, right? I'm going to pay attention to that because it's my parents fighting, hitting each other. It's kind of traumatic. In fact, the problem here isn't necessarily like, you may try to not pay attention, but you can't really avoid it. So check that box. What about memory or the retention? Well, yeah, and in fact, the problem here isn't necessarily that you're going to forget. Usually the problem is you're seeing traumatic experiences is that those are the things that haunt you, right? You can't forget it. You may even want to forget it. You can't. So check that box. Imitation. If you've ever heard how most people who bully, like kids who bully in school, were actually victims of child abuse, you're correct. Again, correlation, not causation, but most are. I can tell you as a therapist who works with kids, I've seen kids act out violently, nasty ways to dogs, to animals, pets, cats. Teddy bears are very common, right? Where they'll tell the teddy bear to shut up and slap it across the face and throw it across the room. And you kind of think, where did he learn that? Right? And I'm being kind and I'm trying to be kind of clean here. I've seen it be worse than that. Well, what's happening here is they're imitating it or reproducing that behavior that they've been seeing. Now, the motivation here is very important. because that's them kind of exhibiting that behavior on their own without being prompted. Now, the thing I didn't mention is that that motivation to do that may not come along for a very long time afterward. In fact, it may come along years later. I gave you the example. I'm a little 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old boy. I'm seeing, mommy and daddy doing this to one another. Well, I'm not daddy. That may come around, 15, 20, 25 plus years later. And then I see myself in that position and I go back on what I learned as a kid. Right? So that's why they say violence is a cycle. It's a cycle of violence. And that really highlights social learning theory, which again is observational learning, right? Because you can't say that that's classical conditioning. You can't say that that's operant conditioning. So tying this into how what we just have learned about learning can tie into being usable in our everyday life is kind of connected to the assignment for this week, right? Training programs in the workplace. So really the goal here is to use behavior change, to use these techniques to change behavior, to focus on modifying employees' actions, attitudes, and skills to improve performance, safety, communication, and overall workplace culture. We can do that through classical conditioning. We can do that through operant conditioning, especially things like positive reinforcement. We can also do that through modeling proper behavior. And that's using the social learning theory principles. So if you're a supervisor and you're doing something that you're telling your subordinates not to do, right? One of those like do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. Well, what do they say? A picture's worth 1,000 words. Me seeing my boss doing something, I'm probably going to be more likely to copy that because he or she's getting away with it. Why shouldn't I do it? And then it falls into this sort of feedback loop and can really help or hurt the business culture that's created through that situation behavior impact model. Just sort of this reciprocal kind of feedback loop that can really compound difficult kind of problematic behaviors. All right, so in conclusion, psychology describes several main methods of learning, including classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning, that explain how individuals acquire and process information through experience and reflection. Each learning method highlights different psychological mechanisms, such as environmental reinforcement and behaviorism or mental processes and cognitive theories, contributing to a more complete understanding of how people develop knowledge and skills. Side note, there is no one that's like better than the other. And even though I talked about classical conditioning, operating conditioning, and social learning theory or observational learning, it's not like, one replaced the other either. Every single day, you know, from the beginning of time to always, we've used classical conditioning, we've used operating conditioning, we've used social learning theory. Last part on here, how was watching others at work change the way you do your job or learn new skills? So this is a reflective question, is kind of really think for a second. And this is the thing, right? I talked about learning as being broader than just studying. It's really how you learn to behave the way you behave. So what I'd like for you to do, just to help better understand this material, is think for a second when you engage in the most monotonous, kind of boring thing you do, especially like at work. How did I learn to do this? Did I learn to do it from watching other people? Did I learn to do it because, maybe I got praise one time, something like operant conditioning? Did I learn to do it just second nature and really quick because it's sort of like classically conditioned? And it's kind of interesting because when you start thinking like that, you'll start seeing it in other people quite a bit. That, again, is very good at kind of building the applicability, the relevance of this course material, but it also really helps you to just learn it, to memorize it. So definitely a good thing. I really hope you all get a chance to do it. All right. And then lastly, if anybody has any questions, please make sure you do reach out to me. Attend office hours. Reach out through Canvas inbox if you have any other types of questions, or if you can't make those office hours, you need to make arrangements to meet me outside of them. That's fine. Also, as always, I will put forward my personal videos on YouTube on behaviorism, on learning. It goes in a little bit greater detail about some of these things that we didn't really get a chance to cover, like reinforcement schedules and some other content. So make sure you check that out if you do have any further questions. Other than that, folks, thank you all for listening. Thank you for paying attention. And I look forward to seeing what kind of work you put forward this week. Take care.